The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History Conservation Laboratory in Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the workbenches where some of the nation's most precious historical artifacts underwent careful restoration and preservation. Dr. Michael Chen, a specialist in early photographic processes and historical image analysis, sat at his station with his attention focused entirely on the daguerreotype plate before him. The October air outside was crisp and cool, autumn descending on the Capitol with its usual spectacular display of changing leaves, but Michael barely noticed the world beyond his workspace. He had been absorbed in this particular project for 3 weeks, and every day brought new revelations. The photograph in question had been donated to the museum by the estate of Virginia Caldwell, a descendant of the prominent Caldwell family that had been instrumental in early conservation efforts in the Appalachian region during the 19th century. The image was dated 1855, making it one of the earliest landscape photographs taken in the American wilderness, predating the famous Western surveys by more than a decade. It showed a pristine stretch of old-growth forest in what was now part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a landscape of towering chestnuts and oaks, their massive trunks rising like cathedral columns into a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The photographer had been Jonathan Caldwell himself, a wealthy Boston businessman who had become fascinated with the new art and science of photography in the late 1840s. Unlike most photographers of his era who focused on portraits and urban scenes, Caldwell had been driven by a passion for the American wilderness, particularly the ancient forests of the southern Appalachians. He had traveled extensively through the region between 1853 and 1860, lugging his heavy photographic equipment up mountain trails and into remote valleys, determined to create a visual record of landscapes that were already beginning to disappear under the axes of timber companies and the expansion of agricultural settlements. Michael had been thrilled when the Caldwell collection arrived at the museum. There were 47 daguerreotypes in total, each one a remarkable document of a lost world. The American chestnut, which had dominated the Appalachian forests in Caldwell's time, had been functionally extinct since the blight of the early 20th century. These photographs showed the trees in their glory, massive specimens that had stood for centuries before Caldwell captured their images on silvered copper plates. The historical and scientific value of the collection was immeasurable, a window into ecosystems that no longer existed, landscapes that had been fundamentally transformed by human activity over the past 170 years. But this particular image, catalogued as Caldwell 23 in the museum's database, had proven to be the most challenging and intriguing of the entire collection. The daguerreotype was in relatively poor condition compared to the others, the silvered surface tarnished and obscured by decades of oxidation and environmental exposure. It had apparently been stored separately from the rest of the collection, found in a different trunk in the Caldwell family attic, wrapped in cloth but not properly sealed against moisture and air. The result was significant degradation that made detailed examination of the image difficult without extensive restoration work. Michael had been using a combination of traditional conservation techniques and modern digital analysis to recover the image. The process was painstakingly slow, involving careful cleaning of the plate's surface, high-resolution scanning under multiple wavelengths of light, and sophisticated software algorithms that could detect and enhance details invisible to the naked eye. The work required patience and precision, qualities that Michael had cultivated over his 15 years in the conservation field, but also an almost archaeological sensitivity to the layers of information contained within damaged historical objects. His colleague and friend, Dr. Rebecca Torres, appeared at his workstation carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was a curator in the museum's division of political and military history, but her background in 19th-century American social movements had made her an invaluable collaborator on the Caldwell project. Rebecca understood the historical context of the photographs in ways that complemented Michael's technical expertise. Together, they had been working to not just restore the images but to understand them, to place them within the broader narrative of American environmental history and the development of conservation philosophy. "Still working on the damaged one?" Rebecca asked, setting one of the coffee cups beside Michael's keyboard. She leaned in to look at his monitor, which displayed a highly magnified section of the digitized daguerreotype. "Any progress?" "Look at this," Michael said, his voice carrying the excitement of discovery. He adjusted the image processing parameters, applying a series of filters that enhanced certain tonal ranges while suppressing others. On the screen, the forest scene became clearer, the individual trees emerging from the tarnish-obscured background. I've been able to recover about 70% of the original detail. The chestnuts are magnificent, probably 300 years old based on their size. But there's something else, something I didn't notice until I started working on this section. He zoomed in on a particular area of the image, approximately 1/3 of the way from the left edge, positioned between two massive tree trunks. As Rebecca watched, Michael applied another series of enhancements, and a shape began to emerge from the dappled forest shadows. It was indistinct at first, just a variation in tone and texture that could have been anything: a fallen log, an unusual rock formation, a trick of light and shadow. But as Michael continued to refine the image processing, the shape resolved into something unmistakable. It was a human figure, standing perfectly still among the trees. Rebecca drew in a sharp breath. "Is that a person?" "In a landscape photograph from 1855. "That's what I've been trying to determine for the past 3 days," Michael replied, applying yet another enhancement algorithm. "At first I thought it might be an artifact of the restoration process, a false pattern created by the image processing software. But I've analyzed it from every angle, used multiple different enhancement techniques, even examined the original plate under magnification. The figure is definitely there on the original daguerreotype. It's extremely faint, which is why it wasn't visible through the tarnish, but it's real. Someone was standing in that forest when Caldwell made this photograph. The figure was positioned in deep shadow, which explained why it was so difficult to see. The exposure time for daguerreotypes in 1855 would have been measured in minutes, not seconds, requiring subjects to remain absolutely motionless to avoid blurring. Landscape photographers typically avoided including people in their compositions for exactly this reason. The long exposures made it nearly impossible for human subjects to remain still enough to be captured clearly. But this figure showed no motion blur at all. Whoever it was had stood with remarkable stillness during the entire exposure, a statue-like presence in the ancient forest. "Can you make out any details?" Rebecca asked, her historian's instincts immediately engaged. "Gender, age, clothing? Anything that might help us identify who this person was or why they were there." Michael shook his head, frustrated by the limitations of the technology and the condition of the original plate. "Not clearly. The resolution isn't good enough, and the figure is too deeply shadowed. I can tell you it's an adult, probably male based on the build and posture, wearing what looks like practical clothing, not formal attire. The stance suggests someone comfortable in the wilderness, not a casual visitor. But beyond that, I'm just guessing." They sat in silence for a moment, studying the ghostly figure on the screen. The presence of this person in the photograph transformed it from a simple landscape documentation into something far more complex and intriguing. Who had been standing in that forest on the day Jonathan Caldwell set up his camera? Why had they been there? And most puzzling of all, why had this particular daguerreotype been separated from the rest of the collection, stored in different conditions that had led to its deterioration? "We need to dig into Caldwell's journals," Rebecca said decisively. "The family donated his papers along with the photographs. I've been going through them cataloging the collection, but I haven't read everything in detail yet. If this photograph was significant enough to be stored separately, there might be some mention of it in his writings." Over the next week, Michael continued his technical analysis of the photograph while Rebecca immersed herself in Jonathan Caldwell's extensive journals and correspondence. The picture of the man that emerged from these documents was fascinating and complex. Caldwell had been born into wealth in 1818, the son of a successful textile manufacturer. He had been educated at Harvard, expected to join the family business, but had instead become obsessed with the new technologies of the industrial age, particularly photography. He had studied with some of the pioneers of American daguerreotypy, learned the chemical and optical principles behind the process, and then devoted himself to pushing the boundaries of what the medium could achieve. But Caldwell's interest in photography was inseparable from his growing concern about the destruction of America's wild landscapes. His journals from the late 1840s and early 1850s were filled with passionate observations about the rapid clearing of forests, the pollution of rivers, the extinction of wildlife populations. He had been influenced by the Transcendentalist movement, had corresponded with Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and had developed a philosophy that saw the preservation of wilderness as both a moral imperative and a practical necessity for the young nation. "Listen to this," Rebecca said, finding Michael in the conservation lab late one afternoon. She had her laptop open, displaying scanned pages from one of Caldwell's journals. "This is from June 1855, right around the time that photograph was taken based on the vegetation and lighting conditions you analyzed." He writes, "I have journeyed into the deepest hollows of the mountains, places where the hand of civilization has not yet reached, where the forests stand as they have for countless centuries. In these cathedral groves, I have encountered others who understand the sacred nature of what exists here, who see in these ancient trees not merely timber to be harvested but living monuments to time itself. There are those who have always known what we newcomers are only beginning to learn, that these mountains and forests are not resources to be exploited but communities to be respected and preserved." Michael looked up from his work, immediately understanding the significance of the passage. He's talking about encountering someone in the forest, someone who shared his conservation values. Could that be the figure in the photograph? "I think so," Rebecca replied, scrolling through more journal entries. "And there's more. He makes several references to guides and teachers who showed him the most pristine forest areas, who helped him understand the ecology of the region. He's frustratingly vague about who these people were, doesn't give names or specific descriptions. But reading between the lines, I think he was being deliberately circumspect, protecting their identities for some reason." They spent the evening going through Caldwell's journals chronologically, mapping out references that might relate to the mysterious figure in the photograph. A pattern began to emerge. In the early 1850s, Caldwell's expeditions into the Appalachian wilderness had been solo ventures, or occasionally accompanied by hired porters who helped transport his equipment. But beginning in 1854, the tone of his journals changed. He started writing about the forest with a deeper knowledge, referencing plant and animal species by names that weren't standard English, describing ecological relationships and seasonal patterns with a precision that suggested he had learned from someone with intimate, long-term knowledge of the landscape. "Indigenous knowledge," Rebecca said quietly. He was learning from native people who still lived in or near these mountains. That would explain why he was so careful about not revealing their identities. This was 1855, remember. The Cherokee removal had happened less than 20 years earlier. There were still people living in hiding in the mountains, avoiding the federal policies that had forcibly relocated most of the Cherokee population. Revealing their presence could have put them in serious danger. Michael felt a chill of realization. The figure in the photograph took on an entirely new significance with this context. It wasn't just an anonymous person who happened to be present when Caldwell made the image. It was potentially a Cherokee survivor who had remained in the ancestral homeland after the Trail of Tears, living in the remote mountain forests, maintaining traditional knowledge about the landscape that Caldwell recognized as valuable and worth preserving, not just through written description but through photographic documentation. But why include them in the photograph at all? Michael wondered. If Caldwell was trying to protect their identity, why risk documenting their presence? Rebecca thought about this, chewing her lower lip in the way she did when working through a complex historical problem. Maybe that's exactly why the figure is so faint, positioned in shadow, almost invisible unless you're specifically looking for it. And maybe that's why this daguerreotype was stored separately from the others. It was meant to be a record, evidence of who the real experts were about these forests, but protected, kept private until it was safe to reveal the truth. Over the following weeks, Michael and Rebecca collaborated on researching the historical context more deeply. They consulted with scholars who specialized in Cherokee history, with environmental historians who studied early conservation movements, with experts on 19th century photography who could help them understand the technical choices Caldwell had made in creating the image. A complex picture emerged of the Appalachian region in the 1850s, a landscape in transition where different cultures and worldviews collided and occasionally found common ground. The Cherokee people had inhabited the southern Appalachian Mountains for thousands of years before European contact. They had developed sophisticated agricultural practices, complex social and political structures, and deep spiritual and practical relationships with the forest ecosystems. The forced removal in the late 1830s, known as the Trail of Tears, had devastated the Cherokee Nation, but not everyone had been removed. Some had hidden in the most remote mountain areas, maintaining their traditional ways of life despite the constant threat of discovery and forced relocation. Others had assimilated to varying degrees, taking English names, adopting European American customs, finding ways to remain in the region without drawing official attention. Jonathan Caldwell's journals suggested he had encountered someone from this surviving or hidden Cherokee community, someone who possessed encyclopedic knowledge of the forest and who shared Caldwell's concern about the destruction of the landscape. The relationship appeared to have been one of mutual respect and shared purpose, transcending the racial and cultural barriers that dominated the broader society of the antebellum South. "I think I found confirmation," Rebecca announced one morning, her voice tight with excitement. She had been working in the museum's archives, going through boxes of Caldwell family papers that hadn't yet been fully cataloged. "There's a letter here, written by Caldwell in 1859, addressed to his brother but apparently never sent. It's tucked inside one of his journals, folded and sealed. The envelope says, 'To be opened only in the event of my death or disappearance.' I had to get special permission from the donor and the museum director to open it, but they agreed it might contain important historical information." She handed Michael a transcription she had made of the letter. His hands trembled slightly as he read Caldwell's precise handwriting, the words revealing secrets that had been kept for more than a century and a half. "My dear brother," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am either dead or have met with misfortune from which I cannot return. There are matters I must reveal that I have kept hidden for the protection of others, but which should be known to history should I not survive to tell the tale myself. In my travels through the southern mountains, I have been privileged to learn from a remarkable individual, a Cherokee man of great wisdom who remained in these forests when his people were forced westward. I will not reveal his name here, even in this private document, for his safety and that of his family must be paramount." The letter continued, describing how Caldwell had met this individual by chance during one of his early photographic expeditions in 1854. Caldwell had become lost in the mountain wilderness, separated from his guide, his equipment damaged by a fall. He had been found and assisted by this Cherokee man, who had not only helped him repair his equipment but had spent several days teaching him about the forest, sharing knowledge about the plants and animals, the seasonal cycles, the delicate interconnections that made the ecosystem function. "He showed me forests that have never been cut," Caldwell wrote, "groves of chestnuts so vast and old that they seem to touch the sky itself. He explained to me that these trees are not merely individual organisms but communities, connected through the soil, supporting each other, creating the conditions for countless other forms of life. He taught me to see the forest not as a collection of timber resources but as a living whole, worthy of preservation for its own sake and for the sake of future generations." The letter described how this relationship had continued over several years, how Caldwell had returned to the mountains repeatedly, always meeting with his teacher in remote locations, learning more about the landscape and about the Cherokee perspective on humanity's relationship with nature. It was this knowledge that had deepened Caldwell's commitment to conservation, that had driven him to create his photographic documentation of the forests before they disappeared. In 1855, the letter continued, I asked if I might include him in one of my photographs, not as a portrait but as a presence in the landscape, a witness to what these forests represent. He agreed, but only on the condition that the image be made in such a way that his identity would remain protected. We chose a location in deep shadow, used a longer exposure than usual, positioned him so that only those who knew to look would see his presence. The photograph exists as a record of our shared commitment to preserving these places, and as acknowledgement that the knowledge I have gained comes not from my own observations alone but from teachings passed down through countless generations of people who knew these mountains long before my ancestors arrived on this continent. Michael and Rebecca sat in stunned silence after reading the letter. The mystery of the figure in the photograph had been solved, But the solution opened up new questions and implications that went far beyond a simple historical curiosity. This was evidence of cross-cultural collaboration in the service of environmental conservation, a relationship between a wealthy white photographer from Boston and a Cherokee survivor of ethnic cleansing, united by their shared love for a landscape that was already disappearing. This changes the entire context of the Caldwell collection, Rebecca said, her voice hushed with the weight of the discovery. We're not just looking at early landscape photography. We're looking at a conscious effort to preserve indigenous knowledge about these ecosystems, to create a record that acknowledged Cherokee expertise and presence at a time when federal policy was trying to erase both. The question is what we do with this information, Michael replied. Caldwell kept this secret to protect someone. Is it appropriate for us to reveal it now, more than 160 years later? It was a question that would require careful consideration, consultation with Cherokee communities, and deep ethical reflection about the responsibilities that came with uncovering historical secrets. The photograph of the figure standing among the ancient trees was no longer just an interesting technical discovery. It had become a document of profound historical and cultural significance, one that needed to be handled with respect and care. The discovery of Caldwell's secret letter transformed the restoration project into something far more complex than a simple conservation effort. Michael and Rebecca knew they needed guidance from people who could speak to the Cherokee perspective on this history, who could help them understand the implications of revealing information that had been deliberately hidden for the protection of those involved. They reached out to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the federally recognized tribe descended from those Cherokee who had remained in or returned to North Carolina after the Trail of Tears. The response came quickly and with considerable interest. Dr. Sarah Walkingstick, a historian and cultural preservation specialist working with the Eastern Band, traveled to Washington to examine the photograph and the associated documents. She was in her 50s, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that seemed to assess everything with calm precision. She carried herself with quiet authority, the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating between different worlds, honoring her Cherokee heritage while operating effectively within academic and governmental institutions. Michael and Rebecca had prepared carefully for her visit, setting up a presentation of all their findings in a private conference room. They showed Dr. Walkingstick the restored photograph with the figure visible among the trees, shared the relevant passages from Caldwell's journals, and finally presented the sealed letter with its revelations about the relationship between the photographer and his unnamed Cherokee teacher, the doctor. Walkingstick studied everything in silence for nearly 30 minutes, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured and thoughtful. "This is extraordinary. Do you understand what you have here? This is documentation of resistance and survival. After the removal, the federal government tried to pretend that no Cherokee people remained in the eastern homelands. But families did remain, hiding in the most remote areas, maintaining their knowledge and practices, keeping alive the relationships with the land that had sustained our people for millennia. This photograph and these documents are proof of that survival, and more importantly, they're proof of knowledge exchange, of a relationship built on mutual respect rather than exploitation." She turned to face Michael and Rebecca directly. "You were right to contact us before making this public. The question of whether to reveal this information and how to present it if we do requires careful consideration of several factors. First, we need to think about the safety and privacy concerns that originally motivated Caldwell's secrecy. Obviously, those specific dangers no longer exist. The person in this photograph, whoever he was, has been dead for well over a century. But there may still be descendants, and their feelings about having their ancestors' hidden existence revealed must be considered. Is there any way to identify who the person might have been?" Rebecca asked. The Cherokee community at that time would have been small enough that someone with the kind of knowledge Caldwell describes might be remembered in oral histories or family traditions. Dr. Walkingstick nodded slowly. "Possibly. We maintain extensive genealogical records and oral histories. The description of someone who remained in the mountains after removal, who had deep ecological knowledge, who was willing to share that knowledge with an outsider who showed respect, that might match records we have. But I'll need time to consult with our community elders, with our genealogists and historians." This is not a decision I can make alone. Over the next 3 months, Dr. Walkingstick worked with the Cherokee community to investigate the historical records and family traditions that might shed light on the identity of the figure in Caldwell's photograph. It was delicate work, requiring sensitivity to family privacy and to the complex emotions surrounding the removal era. Many Cherokee families had lost relatives during the Trail of Tears, and the stories of those who had survived by hiding or resisting were often painful reminders of that trauma. But there was also pride in those survival stories, recognition of the strength and determination it had required to maintain Cherokee presence in the ancestral homeland despite overwhelming forces arrayed against them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Walkingstick contacted Rebecca with news that she had found a potential match, not through official records but through the memories of an elderly woman named Margaret Swimmer, who was 94 years old and considered one of the keepers of traditional knowledge within the Eastern Band community. Margaret's great-great-grandfather had been a man named Solly Swimmer, known in family tradition as someone who had lived deep in the mountains during the dangerous years after removal, who had been renowned for his knowledge of medicinal plants and his understanding of the forest ecosystem. Margaret had agreed to meet with the researchers, intrigued by the possibility that her ancestor might have been documented in this extraordinary photograph. The meeting was arranged at the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina, on neutral ground where Margaret would feel comfortable and supported by her community. Michael and Rebecca made the drive from Washington, bringing with them high-resolution prints of the photograph and copies of the relevant documents. The museum was an impressive building designed to blend Cherokee architectural elements with modern construction, situated in the heart of the Qualla boundary, the land held by the Eastern Band. Inside, exhibits told the story of Cherokee history from ancient times through the present, including unflinching presentations about the Trail of Tears and its aftermath. Michael and Rebecca were met by Dr. Walkingstick and led to a private conference room where Margaret Swimmer waited, accompanied by her daughter and 2 grandchildren. Margaret was small and frail, her face deeply lined, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She studied the photograph intently when they placed it before her, leaning close, her weathered fingers tracing the outline of the figure standing among the trees. She was silent for a long time, and the others waited respectfully, understanding that she was not just looking at the image but thinking, remembering, connecting what she saw to stories she had been told decades ago. "My great-great-grandfather," Margaret said finally, her voice soft but clear, was called Solly, though that was not his only name. He was born in the old way, before the missionaries came with their schools and their rules about how Cherokee people should live. When the soldiers came to force people west, he went into the mountains with his family. He knew places where no white man had ever been, places where the forest was so thick that you could walk for days without seeing the sky. He survived by being invisible, by knowing the land better than anyone who might come looking for him. She paused, accepting a cup of tea from her daughter before continuing. The stories said that he eventually began to move more freely, that enough time had passed that the danger of being forcibly removed had decreased. He would trade sometimes with white families who lived on the edges of the mountains, people who respected his knowledge and wouldn't betray his presence. And there was one man, the stories said, who came from far away with strange equipment, who wanted to make images of the forest. Solly taught this man because he recognized that the man understood something important, that the forests were being destroyed and someone needed to remember what they had been. Margaret looked up from the photograph, her eyes meeting Dr. Walkingstick's. This could be him. The stance is right, the place is right. Solly was not a large man, but he stood like a tree, rooted and strong. And he would have known how to be still, how to become part of the forest so completely that even a long exposure photograph would capture him clearly. "What else do you know about his relationship with the photographer?" Rebecca asked gently. Did the stories include details about what they discussed or why Solly agreed to be photographed? Margaret nodded slowly, gathering her thoughts. The stories said that Solly believed the white people who were cutting down the forests did not understand what they were destroying. They saw trees as lumber, animals as meat or pelts, the land as something to be owned and used. But Solly understood that the forest was alive, that everything in it was connected, that destroying one part would eventually destroy the whole. He wanted someone to remember what had been there, to have proof that the ancient forests had existed, had been magnificent. He thought if people in the future could see what had been lost, maybe they would protect what remained. She touched the photograph again, her fingers gentle on the image. This picture, if it really shows my ancestor, it is a message from him to us. He is standing witness, saying, I was here, I knew this place, I understood its value. He is also saying that not all white people of his time were destroyers. Some, like the photographer, learned to see the forest as Cherokee people saw it, as something sacred worth preserving. The room was quiet, everyone absorbing the profound implications of what Margaret had shared. Michael felt humbled and awed, realizing that his technical work in restoring the photograph had revealed something far more significant than he had imagined possible. This was not just a historical document but a message across time, from one person who loved the forest to future generations who might learn to love and protect it as well. Dr. Walkingstick spoke carefully, addressing Margaret with obvious respect. If we were to make this photograph and its story public, to include it in museum exhibitions and educational materials, would that honor your ancestors' intentions? Or would it violate the privacy he sought by hiding? Margaret considered the question seriously, conferring quietly with her daughter and grandchildren before responding. Times have changed. The dangers Tsali faced no longer exist. His descendants do not need to hide. And the forests he loved are still being lost, still need protection. I think he would want his story told, would want people to know that Cherokee people never truly left these mountains, that our knowledge about this land has value, that conservation is not a new idea invented by white environmentalists but an ancient practice that our people maintained for countless generations. Yes, his story should be told. It should be told with respect and accuracy, but it should be told. With Margaret's permission and guidance, the team began the process of developing a comprehensive presentation of the photograph and its historical context. Dr. Walkingstick became an essential partner in this work, helping to ensure that the Cherokee perspective was accurately and respectfully represented, that the story was told in a way that honored Tsali Swimmer's courage and knowledge rather than treating him as simply an interesting historical footnote to Jonathan Caldwell's photographic career. They worked to gather additional historical context about the Cherokee people who remained in the mountains after removal, about the ecological knowledge that had been maintained and passed down through generations, about the relationship between traditional Cherokee environmental practices and the conservation movement that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The project expanded beyond a simple photograph restoration to become a comprehensive examination of environmental history, indigenous knowledge systems, and cross-cultural collaboration. Michael's technical work on the photograph continued as well. Using the latest image enhancement techniques, he was able to recover additional details that helped confirm Margaret's identification. The figure's posture and positioning matched descriptions of Tsali Swimmer from family stories. The location could be narrowed down to a specific region in what was now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, an area that had been particularly remote in 1855 and that matched geographical references in Caldwell's journals. Rebecca discovered additional letters and journal entries that filled in more details about the relationship between Caldwell and Tsali. The two men had met periodically over a span of about 6 years, from 1854 to 1860. Their meetings were always in remote forest locations, arranged through a complex system of signs and signals that protected Tsali's security. Caldwell had learned not just about forest ecology but about Cherokee philosophy, about ways of understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world that differed fundamentally from the dominant European-American attitudes of the time. What strikes me most, Rebecca said during one of their regular team meetings, is how Caldwell's conservation philosophy evolved through this relationship. His early journal entries show typical 19th century romanticism about wilderness, the idea of nature as sublime but separate from human society. But after he begins learning from Tsali, his thinking changes. He starts writing about forests as communities that include human beings, about the possibility of people living in harmony with their environment rather than in opposition to it. That's a much more sophisticated understanding, one that anticipates modern ecological thinking by decades. Dr. Walkingstick nodded in agreement. That's because he was learning indigenous knowledge systems that had always understood those relationships. Cherokee people didn't conceptualize nature as separate from culture. The forest was home, was provider, was teacher, was relative. The idea that you would destroy it for short-term profit made no sense within that worldview. What Caldwell gained from Tsali was not just information about specific plants or animals, but a completely different framework for thinking about humanity's place in the world. As they prepared for the public unveiling of the photograph and its story, the team grappled with how to present this history in a way that would be accessible to general audiences while maintaining the depth and complexity that the story deserved. They decided on a multi-layered approach, creating an exhibition that could be experienced at different levels depending on the viewer's interest and available time. The centerpiece was the restored photograph itself, displayed large enough that visitors could see the details clearly, including the figure of Tsali standing among the ancient chestnuts. Alongside it were displayed other photographs from the Caldwell collection, showing the majesty of the pre-blight Appalachian forests. Text panels provided historical context about the Trail of Tears and Cherokee survival strategies, about early photography and conservation movements, about the ecological changes that had transformed the landscape over the past century and a half. But the exhibition also included interactive elements that allowed deeper engagement with the material. Visitors could read excerpts from Caldwell's journals and letters, could hear recordings of Margaret Swimmer and other Cherokee elders talking about traditional ecological knowledge and its continued relevance. There were displays showing how the forests photographed by Caldwell had changed over time, with contemporary photographs taken from the same locations showing the loss of the chestnuts and other alterations to the ecosystem. Perhaps most powerfully, the exhibition included a section on contemporary Cherokee conservation efforts, showing how the Eastern Band and other Cherokee communities were working to preserve traditional knowledge and protect remaining wild areas. This connected the historical story to present-day concerns, demonstrating that the issues Tsali and Caldwell had cared about remained urgent more than a century and a half later. The exhibition opened at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History on a cool spring morning, with a ceremony that brought together historians, photographers, environmentalists, and members of the Cherokee community. Margaret Swimmer, though frail and requiring assistance, had insisted on attending, wanting to be present when her ancestors' story was finally told to the world. She sat in the front row during the opening remarks, her family surrounding her with supportive pride. Michael gave a presentation on the technical aspects of the restoration, showing how modern digital analysis had revealed the figure that had been hidden by tarnish and shadow for more than a century and a half. He explained the photographic processes of the 1850s, the challenges of creating clear images with primitive equipment, the skill required to capture a human figure with such clarity during the long exposure times required by daguerreotype technology. His presentation was thorough but accessible, helping audience members understand the significance of the technical achievement represented by the photograph. Dr. Walkingstick spoke about the historical context, about Cherokee resistance and survival during the removal era, about the courage required to maintain cultural identity and traditional knowledge in the face of systematic attempts at erasure. She was careful to frame the story not as one of tragic victims but as one of resilience and adaptation, of people who had found ways to preserve what mattered most despite overwhelming pressures to assimilate or disappear. When we look at this photograph, Dr. Walkingstick said, gesturing to the enlarged image displayed behind her, we need to understand what we are really seeing. Yes, it is a document of environmental history, showing a forest ecosystem that no longer exists in its original form. But it is also a document of human history, of relationships between people who came from very different worlds but who found common ground in their love for this landscape and their concern about its destruction. Tsali Swimmer chose to be in this photograph, chose to be documented as a witness to what these forests represented. That choice was brave and meaningful. It said that Cherokee people had knowledge worth preserving, that our perspectives on environmental stewardship had value, that we deserve to be included in the conversation about the future of these lands. Then Margaret spoke, helped to the podium by her granddaughter. Her voice was soft, and the audience leaned forward to catch every word, recognizing that they were hearing living history, a direct connection to the events documented in the photograph. My ancestors stood in that forest to say that Cherokee people belonged there, that we had never left despite what the government claimed, that our knowledge about how to care for the land was important and should not be lost, Margaret said. Today, when I see this photograph, I feel proud. Proud that Tsalli had the courage to be visible when being invisible had kept him safe. Proud that he understood the value of documenting what existed so that future generations would know what had been lost. And proud that he found someone who respected his knowledge enough to learn from it and to honor it. She paused, gathering her strength, and when she continued, her voice was firmer, carrying a challenge to everyone present. But this photograph should make us uncomfortable as well as proud. The forests that Tsalli and Jonathan Caldwell loved are mostly gone. The chestnuts that stood like pillars in a cathedral are dead, killed by disease brought from overseas. Much of the knowledge that Tsalli carried has been lost too, though we work hard to preserve and revive what remains. This photograph shows us what we lost, what was sacrificed in the name of progress and profit. If we truly want to honor the legacy of the people in this image, we need to protect what forests remain, we need to listen to indigenous knowledge about land stewardship, and we need to remember that every place we destroy, every species we drive to extinction, every traditional practice we allow to fade away, represents an irreplaceable loss not just to one community but to all of humanity. The audience erupted in sustained applause, many people visibly moved by Margaret's words. Michael felt tears on his cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. He looked at the photograph displayed so prominently, at the figure of Tsalli standing among the ancient trees, and felt the weight of responsibility that came with having brought this image back to visibility. It was not enough to simply preserve the photograph. They needed to understand and act on the message it contained. The exhibition proved enormously popular, drawing larger crowds than the museum had anticipated. Visitors spent long periods examining the photograph, reading the contextual materials, engaging with the interactive displays. Many commented in the visitor feedback forms about how the story had changed their understanding of environmental history, helping them see conservation not as a recent invention but as a set of practices and philosophies that had deep roots in indigenous cultures. Educational programs developed around the exhibition brought school groups through, using the photograph as a starting point for discussions about history, ecology, technology, and ethics. Students were challenged to think about whose voices were included in historical narratives and whose were omitted, about how technology could be used to recover lost knowledge, about the ongoing relevance of indigenous environmental wisdom in addressing contemporary ecological crises. Media coverage of the exhibition was extensive, with articles appearing in major newspapers and magazines, segments on television news programs, and viral social media posts that brought the story to millions of people who would never visit the museum in person. The image of Tsalli standing among the ancient chestnuts became iconic, shared widely as a symbol of indigenous resilience and environmental stewardship, but with visibility came complications. Some critics questioned whether it was appropriate to have revealed Tsalli's presence at all, arguing that the decision to remain hidden should be respected in perpetuity. Others debated whether the exhibition gave sufficient attention to the darker aspects of the historical period, to the violence and injustice that had driven Tsalli into hiding in the first place. And some Cherokee community members expressed mixed feelings about having their history displayed in a Smithsonian museum, an institution that had not always treated indigenous peoples or their cultural materials with respect. Dr. Walkingstick addressed these concerns thoughtfully in a series of public discussions. There are no perfect answers here, she acknowledged. Revealing historical information always involves ethical complexities, particularly when dealing with marginalized communities and individuals who took great risks to survive. But Margaret Swimmer and other descendants who were consulted felt strongly that Tsalli's story should be told, that keeping it hidden served no one's interests at this point. As for whether this exhibition does justice to the full complexity of the history, I would say it makes a good start, but there is always more work to be done. History is not a finished product but an ongoing conversation, and exhibitions like this are contributions to that conversation, not the final word. Rebecca worked with the museum's education department to develop follow-up programs that addressed some of the critical questions raised by the exhibition. They organized symposia that brought together indigenous scholars, environmental historians, ethicists, and conservation professionals to discuss how historical knowledge could and should inform contemporary environmental practice. They created educational materials that could be used by teachers to help students think critically about historical narratives, about whose perspectives were included and excluded, and about how to approach indigenous knowledge systems with respect and humility. Michael, meanwhile, continued his work on the broader Caldwell collection. The revelation about Sally's presence in one photograph led to closer examination of the others, looking for additional evidence of human presence or influence in what had initially appeared to be pristine wilderness landscapes. He found subtle traces in several images, marks on trees that might have been trail blazes, cleared areas that could have been small agricultural plots, smoke visible in the distance that suggested human habitation. These discoveries reinforced Dr. Walkingstick's point that the Appalachian forests of the 1850s were not uninhabited wilderness but landscapes actively inhabited and managed by Cherokee people who had remained in their homeland. 6 months after the exhibition opened, Michael received an email from a researcher at the University of Tennessee who had been inspired by the Caldwell story to investigate other early photographic collections for similar hidden information. Using techniques similar to those Michael had employed, this researcher had found evidence of indigenous presence in several 19th-century Western landscape photographs that had previously been interpreted as showing untouched wilderness. It appeared that the practice of including indigenous people in landscape photographs while positioning them subtly or in ways that made them easy to overlook had been more common than previously recognized. This could be a new field of research, Rebecca said excitedly when Michael shared the news. Re-examining historical photograph collections for hidden or obscured information about indigenous presence and knowledge. Think about how many museum and archive collections there are, how many thousands of images that have never been subjected to modern analytical techniques. We could be looking at a fundamental revision of environmental history, moving away from narratives of pristine wilderness being discovered and exploited by European Americans to more accurate accounts of landscapes that were inhabited and managed by indigenous peoples and then systematically dispossessed. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians expressed interest in developing their own capacity for this kind of photographic analysis, wanting to take an active role in recovering their own visual history rather than leaving it entirely in the hands of outside researchers. Michael and Dr. Walkingstick collaborated on a proposal for a training program that would teach Cherokee community members the technical skills needed for photograph restoration and analysis, funded through a combination of federal grants and private foundation support. The goal was to empower indigenous communities to control how their own historical materials were preserved, interpreted, and presented to the public. Margaret Swimmer lived to see the training program begin, though her health was failing. On her 95th birthday, she gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker who was creating a film about the Caldwell photograph and its broader implications. In the interview, she reflected on what it meant to her to know that her ancestors' presence had been documented and preserved. For so long, the story we heard about Cherokee people in the 19th century was only about loss and suffering, about the trail of tears and removal, Margaret said, her voice still clear despite her physical frailty. Those things were real and should not be forgotten. But that was not the only story. There were also stories of survival, of resistance, of keeping our culture and knowledge alive despite everything that was done to destroy them. Seeing my great-great-grandfather standing in that forest, being visible, being recorded by someone who respected him, that is a different kind of story. It says we were here, we never left, our knowledge mattered, and we had allies who recognized our worth. That is a story my great-great-grandchildren need to know. 3 months later, Margaret passed away peacefully, surrounded by family. The museum held a memorial service for her, recognizing her crucial role in helping interpret and contextualize the photograph. Without her willingness to share family stories and memories, the identity of the figure in the forest might never have been confirmed, and the full significance of the image would have remained unknown. At the memorial service, Dr. Walkingstick spoke about Margaret's legacy, about how she had devoted her long life to preserving and passing forward Cherokee knowledge and culture. Margaret understood something fundamental, Dr. Walkingstick said. She understood that preservation is not about keeping things frozen in the past, unchanged and untouched. Real preservation means keeping knowledge alive and relevant, adapting it to new circumstances while maintaining its essential wisdom. She saw the photograph of her ancestor not as an artifact to be locked away, but as a living message to be shared and learned from. That is how she approached all of traditional knowledge, not as museum pieces but as tools for living well in the world. 2 years after the exhibition opened, Michael and Rebecca co-authored a book about the Caldwell collection and the discovery of Tsali Swimmer in the photograph. The book combined technical analysis, historical research, and Cherokee perspectives on environmental knowledge, creating a comprehensive account that had academic rigor while remaining accessible to general readers. Dr. Walkingstick contributed a substantial chapter on Cherokee ecological practices and their continued relevance to contemporary conservation challenges. Margaret's granddaughter, who had become active in Cherokee cultural preservation work, wrote an epilogue about her grandmother's life and legacy. The book was titled Standing Witness: Photography, Indigenous Knowledge, and Environmental Memory in the Appalachian Mountains. It received widespread critical acclaim and won several awards for historical writing and environmental literature. More importantly, it became a catalyst for additional research and action. Several other museums and archives reached out to Michael's team, requesting assistance in examining their own photographic collections for similar hidden information about indigenous presence and perspective. The National Park Service, which managed much of the land that had once been the forest photographed by Caldwell, including areas within the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, initiated a partnership with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into park management practices. This was not simply symbolic consultation but substantive collaboration, with Cherokee knowledge holders working alongside park ecologists to inform decisions about forest management, wildlife protection, and visitor education. Michael was invited to give a TED Talk about the restoration project and its implications. Standing on the stage with the photograph of Tsali displayed behind him, he spoke about how technology and human attention could recover lost stories, how what appeared to be empty landscape could reveal human presence when examined with care and respect, how the past continued to speak to the present if we were willing to listen. When I first started working on this photograph, Michael said to the audience, I was focused on the technical challenge on using modern digital tools to reverse the effects of age and damage. I saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a demonstration of what conservation science could achieve. But the more I worked with the image, the more I understood that restoration is never just technical. Every historical object carries stories, perspectives, worldviews that we need to understand and honor. The figure standing among those trees was not a flaw in the image or an accident of photographic process. He was a person making a deliberate choice to be witnessed, to say to the future that he and his knowledge existed and mattered. Our job as researchers and museum professionals is not just to preserve objects but to understand and share the human stories they contain. The talk went viral, viewed millions of times online. Michael received messages from people around the world who had been moved by the story, who saw connections to their own experiences of marginalization or environmental concern, who felt inspired to look more carefully at the historical materials in their own communities for hidden voices and perspectives. Rebecca used the platform provided by the book's success to advocate for more inclusive approaches to environmental history. She published a series of articles arguing that conservation movements in the United States had often excluded or marginalized indigenous peoples, despite the fact that indigenous communities had been practicing sustainable land management for thousands of years before European contact. The Caldwell-Tsali relationship, she argued, demonstrated what was possible when indigenous knowledge was respected rather than dismissed, when cross-cultural collaboration was based on mutual recognition of expertise rather than exploitation. Environmental movements need to reckon with their history, Rebecca wrote in one influential essay. Too often, conservation has meant removing indigenous peoples from their homelands in order to create pristine wilderness areas, as if human presence and environmental health were incompatible. But the evidence shows something very different. Many of the landscapes we consider most ecologically valuable were shaped by thousands of years of indigenous management. When we exclude indigenous knowledge and presence, we're not protecting nature, we're destroying the very relationships that maintained ecological balance for countless generations. The Eastern Band's cultural preservation program, strengthened by the attention and resources generated by the photograph story, began documenting traditional ecological knowledge systematically, working with elders to record information about plant uses, seasonal indicators, habitat management practices, and other environmental wisdom before it was lost. This information was being compiled into educational materials used in Cherokee schools and shared with conservation organizations working in the region. One outcome that particularly pleased Michael was a collaboration between the Conservation Lab at the Smithsonian and Cherokee community members to restore and digitize a large collection of historical photographs held by the Museum of the Cherokee Indian. Many of these images had been taken by anthropologists and other outsiders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often depicting Cherokee people in ways that reinforced stereotypes or that failed to respect their dignity. The restoration project was not just about improving image quality but about recontextualizing these photographs, adding Cherokee perspectives and stories that complicated and enriched the historical narrative. "What we're doing," explained one of the Cherokee researchers working on the project, "is taking control of our own images, our own story." For too long, photographs of Cherokee people were used to support narratives created by outsiders, narratives that often emphasized our supposed primitiveness or our disappearance. But these are our ancestors in these photographs, and we have our own stories about them, our own understandings of what their lives meant. This restoration work lets us tell those stories, lets us say, this is who these people really were, this is what matters about their lives. 5 years after the initial exhibition, Michael returned to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for a commemorative event. The Park Service had worked with the Eastern Band to create a permanent interpretive exhibit at one of the visitor centers, featuring the Caldwell photographs and telling the story of Tsali Swimmer and the relationship between indigenous knowledge and early conservation philosophy. The exhibit was designed in consultation with Cherokee community members, ensuring that it presented history from multiple perspectives rather than from a single authoritative viewpoint. The event was scheduled for late autumn, when the mountain forests would be displaying their spectacular fall colors, a reminder of the natural beauty that had inspired both Caldwell and Tsali. Michael hiked into a remote section of the park that matched the location in Caldwell's photograph, accompanied by Dr. Walkingstick, Rebecca, and several Cherokee elders who served as knowledge keepers for traditional ecological practices, standing among the trees, which, while not as massive as the ancient chestnuts that had dominated the forest in 1855, were still impressive specimens of oak and maple. Michael tried to imagine what it had been like when Tsali had stood in this spot, what it had meant to him to be photographed, what he had hoped the image might convey to the future. The forest was quieter than it would have been in Tsali's time, the absence of the chestnuts having altered the entire ecosystem, but it was still beautiful, still powerful, still worthy of protection and respect. Dr. Walkingstick led a brief ceremony, speaking in Cherokee and then translating into English. She thanked the ancestors for their wisdom and courage, thanked the land for continuing to support life despite the damage it had sustained, and committed the group to continuing the work of preservation and knowledge-keeping that Tsali and Caldwell had begun more than a century and a half ago. "We stand here today as witnesses," Dr. Walkingstick said, "just as Tsali stood as a witness in 1855. We witness what remains of these forests, what has been lost and what still survives. We witness the knowledge that our elders carry, knowledge that connects us to this land and teaches us how to live in balance with it. And we witness our responsibility to future generations to pass forward both the knowledge and the land itself, protected and honored, so that they too can stand in forests like this and feel the connection to all who came before." One of the elders, a man named Walker Cucumber who was known for his knowledge of medicinal plants, walked slowly through the forest, pointing out species that would have been familiar to Tsali, explaining their uses and the proper ways to harvest them sustainably. Michael listened intently, recognizing that he was receiving a gift of knowledge that had been maintained and passed down through uncounted generations, knowledge that was practical and spiritual simultaneously, that saw the forest not as a collection of resources but as a community of beings deserving respect. As they prepared to hike back out, Michael paused to take a photograph of the forest, using a digital camera that Caldwell would have found incomprehensible with its instantaneous captures and unlimited capacity. But despite the vast technological changes, Michael realized he was doing fundamentally the same thing Caldwell had done, creating a record of this place in this moment, documenting what existed so that future people might know and value it. That evening, at the interpretive exhibit opening, there was a sense of completion but also of continuation. The photograph of Tsali standing among the ancient chestnuts was displayed prominently, but it was contextualized by contemporary images of the forest, by information about ongoing conservation efforts, by statements from Cherokee community members about traditional ecological knowledge and its modern applications. The exhibit made clear that this was not just a historical story but a living one, relevant to current challenges and ongoing work. A young Cherokee woman named Sarah Wilnedy, who had participated in the photograph restoration training program, gave a presentation about how she was using the skills she had learned to work with historical photographs from her own family collection. She showed images she had restored of her great-grandparents, of the land they had farmed, of traditional practices they had maintained. The technical restoration work had given her a deeper connection to her own history, she explained, had helped her understand the strength and knowledge of her ancestors. When I learned how to reveal hidden details in old photographs, Sarah said, I realized I was also learning how to see my own history more clearly. Things that had seemed faded or obscured became sharp and meaningful. Faces I had only known from blurry images became real people with expressions and personalities. It's the same thing that happened with the photograph of Tsali Swimmer. By looking more carefully, by using the right tools and techniques, we can recover what seemed lost. And that gives us strength for the present and hope for the future. Michael was asked to say a few words at the end of the event. He had prepared remarks but set his notes aside, speaking instead from the heart about what the past several years had taught him. When I first looked at that photograph of the forest, I saw trees and light and shadow, he said. I saw a technical challenge, a damaged image that needed restoration. But it took time and help from many people to see what was really there, to understand that the photograph was not just documenting a landscape but was making a statement about knowledge and respect, about relationships between people from different worlds who found common ground in their love for the land. He paused, looking at the faces in the audience, Cherokee community members and park rangers, historians and environmentalists, all of them drawn together by this story. What I've learned is that restoration is never finished. We restored the photograph, revealed Tsali's presence, told his story. But that's just the beginning. The real restoration work is ongoing. It's about maintaining the relationships between people and land, about preserving and honoring knowledge that has been marginalized or dismissed, about building a future where diverse ways of understanding and caring for the world are respected and valued. The event concluded with a Cherokee drum circle and social dancing, traditional practices that had survived all attempts at suppression, that continued to connect people to their heritage and to each other. Michael, Rebecca, and Dr. Walkingstick stood together watching, moved by the beauty and power of traditions that had endured for so long. Margaret would have loved this, Dr. Walkingstick said softly. She worked so hard to keep traditions alive, to pass them forward to younger generations. She would be proud to see so many young people here, learning and practicing what she taught. 10 years after the restoration project began, Michael was invited back to the Smithsonian for an event commemorating a decade of the exhibition. The photograph of Tsali in the forest had become one of the museum's most iconic images, printed on posters and postcards, studied by countless students and researchers, viewed by millions of visitors. But rather than feeling that the story had been exhausted, Michael found that it continued to generate new insights and inspire new work. A new generation of researchers had taken up the challenge of recovering hidden indigenous presence in historical photographs and documents. Archives across the country were being re-examined with new tools and new questions, revealing evidence of indigenous survival, resistance, and knowledge maintenance that had been overlooked or deliberately obscured. The methods Michael had developed for analyzing the Caldwell photograph had been refined and expanded, becoming standard practice in the field. The Cherokee community's cultural preservation programs had flourished, with the photograph of Tsali serving as an inspiration and symbol of resilience. Young Cherokee people spoke about how knowing that their ancestors had maintained their presence and knowledge despite overwhelming pressure gave them strength to face contemporary challenges, to maintain their own cultural identity, to contribute their perspectives to environmental and social justice movements. The anniversary event. Michael stood once again before the photograph that had changed his life and his understanding of his work. The figure of Tsali standing among the ancient trees looked back at him across a century and a half, a witness to what had been, a messenger to what might be. The photograph was no longer just an artifact to Michael. It was a reminder that every act of attention, every effort to see more clearly and understand more deeply, every choice to honor rather than exploit, made a difference that could echo forward through time. The restoration was complete, but its impacts continued to unfold, rippling outward in ways that could never be fully predicted or measured. And that, Michael had come to understand, was exactly as it should be. History was not dead facts to be preserved under glass but living knowledge that could inform present choices and shape future possibilities. The photograph of Tsali Swimmer, hidden for so long in shadow and tarnish, had emerged into the light not as a relic but as a voice, still speaking, still teaching, still calling on all who saw it to witness, to remember, to act with wisdom and respect.